Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History.
So Chantal, we changed position. We're now in the Second World War commemoration room. The First World War, thank God, it came to an end. It was a difficult period for Brussels, as he told me. So I heard that the next 10, 20 years are called the Roaring Twenties. Is this true for Belgium, yes or no? And what major events happened in this interbellum period?
Yes, of course. In a certain way, we can indeed speak about the Roaring Twenties, but you have also to imagine that not everyone was involved in that movement. And in a certain way, there was also a new form of moralization. They wanted the idea to control the women. We were in the model. A lot of people died during the war, so there was a fear of kind of demographic gap, even if in the Belgian context it's completely different than in France. But nevertheless, the idea from France influenced Belgium. So the way it was not a period of emancipation for the women, and in a certain way, the idea of controlling the women, their bodies, was still very, very present. So Roaring Twenties, it was only, we have images of women that are going to dance, to drink, that smoke, that change their way of being clothed. So it was not the case for every woman. So you have to imagine that. Nevertheless, certain aspects changed. It was also the period development of radio. It was also the period working day was only 8 hours. So that means that people had more time to do something else. And in the 30s, we will have the first holidays, the paid holidays that were introduced in 1936. So in a certain way, life changed. New profession also appeared. Nurseries, secretaries. It was also the first period development of what we call the third sector. So there were a lot of offices. As I also said, school became mandatory in Belgium in 1914. So that means in the interwar period, every child should go to school until 12. So that means a lot of new schools. So in a certain way, the life changed. There were also a new social legislation that was introduced. So there was a kind of optimism in the 30s, even if it was an optimism that will dealt with the economic crisis of 1929. So Belgium will not immediately be touched by it. When we see the figures of unemployment in 1930, so the first year, it was only 2%, 2%. But then in 1932, 20%.
Wow.
So that means that at that period, Belgium was really confronted to the economic crisis. And we all have in mind, for example, the film of Henri Storck, Misère au Borinage. So big strikes, people that were suffering because of the wage, because of unemployment. So really, it was a really difficult period. And in fact, the different government didn't know how to deal with this. It was not only the case in Belgium, it was also the case in other countries throughout this. Inflation, how to deal with unemployment. They tried classical methods, so that mean limiting the wages, trying to send women at home again. All classical methods that were still used after, but it doesn't help.
No.
So in 1936, we had a devaluation of the Belgian franc from 28%. And in a certain way, of course, that was important because Belgium was a country that tried to export a lot of industrial products that were products in the Belgian factories. In a certain way, it helped. But for other groups of the population, and what we are now calling the middle classes, it's a key concept today also. For the middle class, this devaluation was something really difficult. So it means that, for example, you had 100 francs, and then you had no longer 100, but you had 72. So for those middle classes, it was something really difficult. And it was also a period on international level. It was also the period Germany was since January 1933 under the auspice of the Nazi regime. There were also other dictatorships that were introducing slowly everywhere in Europe. So there was also a crisis of the democratic idea. How could democracy bring an answer to that economic crisis? And democracy seems powerless in face of that economic crisis. And so that also has influenced that new political parties appeared on the Belgian scene. And so if we look at the results since 1919, so since the introduction of one man, one vote, what we call the traditional parties, Liberal, Socialist, Catholic, kept 90% of the voters. And in 1936, for the very first time, they only kept 75%. And so that means that three untraditional parties kept a lot of votes. And those three parties were, on one hand, the Rexist movement that was created in 1936, and that was the leader was Léon de Grelle, well known, and he will be a collaborator during the Second World War. On Flemish level, you had the VNV, Vlaams Nationaal Verbond. It was an undemocratic political Flemish nationalist party that was created in 1933, that took part for the very first time also at the election of 1936. So you had two newcomers, Rex and VNV.
The VNV is right-wing as well?
It's also very right-wing, undemocratic. It was very close to fascist New Order, fascist discourse. And it was also the case of the Rexist movement. And then you had a third actor that was not a new one, that was an actor that goes back to the 20s, was the Communist Party. But until then, he had very limited audience. And for the very first time, he came from 3 to 9 deputies in the assembly. So that means those elections had a very strong impact on the political climate. So for the political traditional parties, it was really an alarm. How could we deal with this? How could we find an answer to the economic situation? And also on international level, situation was becoming more and more complicated. You had also civil war in Spanish. In Nazi Germany, you had more and more anti-Semitic measures that were taken. You had also other acts from the Nazi authority. So that means that you had also a lot of refugees, not only Jewish, but also refugees, political refugees. And so in 1939, you had almost 2,000 refugees that were arriving in Belgium every month. I think we are now talking about 4,000. So you can make a comparison between that period and today. So that means that, and also the economic crisis was still there. And some of those foreigners were, of course, accused of taking the job, accepting lower wages. So a discourse that we still have today. So the situation was very touchy, very tricky. And there was also the perception of an international tension, because before the First World War, no one had imagined the war should come to Belgium in 1914. But in the 30s, in a certain way, people were prepared to this. They were, of course, afraid of a new war, and that explained also why some people were very neutralist and that were wanted to escape the war, even if the price should be very high to this. But for example, the Belgian state also distribute the text of the Convention of Den Haag, which is a very important document of regulation of war, to all the civil servants. So that means there was, in a certain way, a kind of preparation. And then from September 1939, we entered the period that's called in the history the Funny War. And so that means that there was mobilization, and from then on, there were all new economic difficulties, because that men were mobilized, so that in some farmers could no longer produce, and so on. So already there were a kind of economic difficulties that started already in the 30s in a context of a very difficult economic situation.
So to recap, After the First World War, Brussels, Belgium is in a pretty bad state because we were invaded. But then the 20s, with the voting rights, things are getting better again. Yeah, the cinema, jazz, people having a good time. The crash causing a ripple effect, and now the ugly face of fashion is showing itself. You mentioned Nazi Germany. As everyone knows, Belgium was invaded during the Second World War. How did the Second World War start off? I know you can write books about this, but just to try and keep it short, how was Belgium invaded? And how was this 4/5 year period for Brussels? Was it the same as World War I, or was it different, or how was it?
Yes, of course, we could spend hours speaking about that period. In fact, what's interesting to mention, for first of all, is in January 1940, there was a crash of a German plane, and on his board there were plans of invasion of Belgium. So it's very interesting. So we had really the idea war is coming,
and people saw it. The state found it, or
yes, because the plane crashed, and on board they found plans of the invasion of Germany. So on 10 May. Not only Belgium, but also the Netherlands, which were neutral during the First World War, Luxembourg and France were invaded. 1 month before, it was also the case of Denmark and Norway. So that means that we knew,
we felt it coming.
Yes, but on that, of course, everyone was hoping to avoid it because everyone had still in mind what had happened during the First World War, the millions of deaths of the First World War. So, of course, you always want to escape. But nevertheless, on 10 May, so that means for Brussels, there are no ultimatum this time. It's an invasion without any ultimatum. So on 5 hour in the morning, there were planes above Brussels. So it was really the war. It was announced on the radio. And a lot of people had in mind what happened during the First World War. So that means that once again, a lot of people tried to escape. So between 1.5 and 2 million people, or even more, because we have no exact figures, tried to escape. They went to France, and we have all in mind those images of movies of lots of refugees.
My great-grandmother and grandparents, they fled to France actually as well.
Yeah. A lot of people couldn't even go until there because there were bombings everywhere. So some people tried to escape by train. The railway were bombing, so they stopped there, and some people immediately had to go back. But nevertheless, so that means that it's one of the most common experience of the Belgian people during the Second World War is that they try to escape and try to go abroad. So the story is different in that way that during the First World War, Belgian army never capitulated. So it was still in war between Belgium and Germany from 1914 to 1918, while during the Second World War, after 18 days, Belgian army capitulated. It was an initiative of the King Leopold III. It was one of the aspects of the conflict between the king and the government that will lead after the war to what's called the royal question. So on 18th of May, so after 8 days, the German arrived in Brussels.
Very fast.
The Nazi flag was put above the Grand Place, so very, very symbolic, and they used public space. So you saw German soldiers, German tanks in all the symbolic places. You see them before the Royal Palace, at the Royal places, before in the great boulevard, in the boulevard of the center of the city. So it was really a symbolic taking of the city. But what is different with the First World War is at the very beginning of the occupation, the Germans try to give a positive image of themselves. So you have pictures showing them helping old women. You see in some diary that they stand up in the trams for the women and so on. So during the summer of 1940, it was a complete different images. You see the soldiers, they are really discovering the city in a kind of touristic way. You see them looking at the city map to see where are we. You see them in the cafes, in the metropole. You have
drinking Belgian beer.
Yes, you have a lot of those images during the summer of 1940. And for the Belgian population, it's a really complicated context because the crisis of democracy. Germany appears as being very, very powerful, and you don't have to forget in the summer and the autumn of 1940, except Great Britain, there is no one, again, in war against Germany. France has capitulated, the Netherlands has capitulated after 5 days.
Russia is not involved
The,
yet.
the Russian are not, Soviet Union is not involved, United States are not involved into the war. So only Great Britain is still in war against Germany. So for the Belgian population, but also for the Belgian elites, are members of political traditional parties, it's a really a very difficult moment. And that explains why, when you compare to what has happened during the summer of 1940, where there was this very brutal confrontation with the Brussels mayor, for example, and the imprisonment of Adolf Max, during the summer and the autumn of 1940, there is what is called a kind of accommodation, political of lesser evil. And so the Belgian authorities, not the government, because he's first in France and then in the autumn he will go to London, but the local authorities and what we call the Comité of the Secrétaires Généraux, so the higher civil servant of each ministry, which are more or less kind of shadow government during the Second World War. They are those who are talking with the German. And because of the memory of the First World War, they accept a lot of things. And for example, in Brussels, but also everywhere in the country, they accept the idea of registration of the Jewish people. Who are Jewish people in Belgium? Because that's also very different of other countries. Most of them are foreigners. They are people that arrived very recently. 90% of the Jewish population has not the Belgian nationality. So there is also a kind of xenophobic reaction towards those groups. And for the mayor, they don't want to be in danger to protect those people for which they have not a very important considerations. So the context is really different. But of course, more during the occupation, the context will become more and more difficult. Also on economic level, and from really already during the summer of 1940, you have to have tickets to buy bread, to buy meat, coal, potatoes, clothes, and so on. So the economic context will become difficult, even if it will never be as difficult as it has been during the First World War. So the risk of starving is not the same during the Second World War than it was during the First World War. But nevertheless, the economic situation is becoming more and more difficult. And also, from, let's say, November, the symbolic date of 11 November 1940, a first patriotic reaction. You see on 11 November 40, which is completely forbidden, a lot of people in Belgium going to the unknown soldier, and they are doing nothing but just being there. Yeah. And it's of course something very symbolic to show to the German the Belgian identity, the Belgian prideness still exists. And from 1941, but even more from 1942, small underground movement will develop, and after June 1941, also you will have a very important communist involvement into resistance. You will have a lot of underground newspapers. There are almost 700 different titles from underground newspapers in Belgian context. You had already some of those titles during the First World War, but during the Second War, it's a very huge phenomenon. So you have a lot of what we call civilian resistance. From 1942, there will be still more measures against the Jewish, and with the introduction of the
Yellow Star.
The Yellow Star in May 1942. And that was really a shock, because it showed to the people stigmatization of the Jewish population. So even people that were not supposed to be sympathetic to Jews begin to help them, because it was a kind of sign.
Yeah.
And it was also a sign for the local authorities. And here in Brussels, it's important to notice that, for example, the mayor refused to cooperate with the Germans to deal those yellows. What was not the case in Antwerp.
Who was the mayor at this point?
The first mayor was Joseph van der Meulenbroek. Then he was suspended by the German, and he was replaced by a man that's called Jules Koolst. And so he was not the mayor in title. He had not really the title. He was faisant fonction, we call that in French. So he He had the function, but not really the title.
Yeah.
But he refused to tell the Yellow Star. And also, in September 1942, he refused that the police of Brussels took part to the roundups that were organized by the German to arrest the Jewish people. So that was also a sign to the population of resistance. And also in 1942, still in October, mandatory work in Germany was introduced. So that was also one of the first measures. Every family could be touched by it. And so from then on, a lot of people tried to escape. That didn't mean that they resist actively, not all of them, but they were concerned. And there was a growing opposition.
So things are going bad for Nazi Germany after Stalingrad. I mean,
Yes. Also, the fact that on the international level the situation was completely changing had also, of course, an impact in occupied Belgium, and more people began to become very hostile to the Germans, of course, but also to those who involved into collaboration.
Yeah, because you talk about these collaborators, and I've done some research into this. You mentioned Léon de Grelle. He was like the head figure for collaboration. Did Flemish and Walloon men fight or collaborate with the Nazis?
Yes. One of the most important form of collaboration is military collaboration. So people who went to fight with the German in Soviet Union against the Soviet army.
How many people are we talking about?
We are talking about 10,000 Flemish people and more or less 8,000 French-speaking people. So it's quite a lot. And you had also people that were there not for direct military purpose, but that helped with the infrastructure. So it's even more. But you had not only military collaboration, you had also political collaboration. So a lot of people under the German occupation succeed to become mayor of their town, so Rexist or Flemish nationalists. You had also, of course, economic collaboration, some factories that accept to work with the German. You had also cultural collaboration. It's more difficult because during the war, it was a period you had no American movies again, no comics. So that means that for a lot of cultural producers, it was also an opportunity. They could work. They had a kind of monopoly in the Belgian context. And you had also one of the most awful form of collaboration. That's denunciation. You denounce your neighborhood. You denounce someone from your work. So you had an important form of collaboration. And after,
over the levels of society, people used Nazism or fascism to work their way up the ladder.
Yes, to promote themselves by opportunism, but also some of them, because of that deep crisis of the democratic values of in the 30s, a lot of people were convinced of the superiority of fascism, of Nazi ideology. So some of them were opportunists, but others were really convinced by the Nazi ideology. And at the end of the war, of course, the Belgian state organized a huge repression against that form of collaboration. And there were more or less 400,000 files that were open.
Wow.
And finally, 53,000 of people were condemned because of one of those forms of collaboration. So if we compare that with what had happened after the First World War, there was a very huge group of collaborators. But we still must say that collaboration and resistance were marginal behavior. So we can consider that 5 to 10% of the population was really actively involved, because for the most of the population, the most of the family, the idea was during the war, how can I survive? How can I protect my family? How can I do as much as possible so that the life is going on the most normally possible? And so, of course, some of them were engaged, but it was only a very minority. And regarding to Brussels, if you want to pick out some significant moments, you have, of course, in November 1943, Le Faux Soir, and also the resistance group succeeded to produce a false soir that was, of course, controlled by the Nazi German, and they succeed to bring it in some places where the newspaper was sold, and it was a very big humor act of resistance. You had also some murders, even in Brussels, for example. You had the murder of Paul Collin, which was an important figure of collaboration. He was killed in April 1943 by three young resistants that were immediately arrested and immediately sentenced to death by the German occupiers. So violence is something that is becoming more and more present the more the war is going on, and especially in Brussels, because you have the presence of the German, you have the presence of a lot of collaborators that are on the streets. And so in the month Augustus 1944, after the landing in Normandy, which is very quickly known here in Belgium, the tension is growing for the collaborators. They know it's the end, so they need to have money, and they will, for example, attack a lot of jewelry here in Brussels, and they will kill some of the people of the shops to have money to fly. And on 3 September, a lot of them are already flying. Some Germans are still present, and it's the episode of the Palace of Justice, which is in flame because the Germans want to put on fire some traces of what was the occupation. And at the end of the day, on 3 September, the Brigade Piron, which is a new form of the Belgian army that was recreated in London, and the British ally arrived in Brussels, and it's go very, very fast, very quick. There are not many struggles because the Germans are fleeing, and in less than 10 days, we could say that almost all the country is liberated. Of course, there will still be the episode of the
Battle of the Bulge in
the Battle of the Bulge in December, but nevertheless, between 2 Septembers, so it's the entry in the south of the country, and let's say 18 Septembers, more or less all the country is free.
Wow, very fast.
Yes, very fast.
So yeah, the Nazis, they fled pretty quickly. Was Brussels destroyed during the war, or was it intact?
It was more or less intact. There was not so much destruction. In fact, we could say what we call today the north-south connection. So the junction between the South Station and the North Station has occurred more destruction than the war itself. So of course, there has been some places where there were struggles at the very end of the war, but we could not say that Brussels was really destroyed by the war. But afterwards, and the junction between North and South Station will be it started already before the First World War, and it's only finished in the 50s. So it changed a lot the physiognomy of the city, and a lot of neighborhoods completely disappeared. All the neighborhood in the surroundings of the central station completely changed due to that huge destruction.
But the Second World War, it interrupted it, and it made the project even longer.
Even longer, yes, of course.
Good, so that's positive. Brussels didn't get destroyed, and masses. In short, this from 1900 to 1950. How did the city expand? What community did it add? Some parts like communities, or
so we could say at the end of the 19th century, what I called the Conference of the Mayor of Brussels. At the very beginning, there were 8 municipalities, and the idea was when municipality developed and joined Brussels agglomeration, they also joined that conference. Before the end of at the end of the 30s, we can consider that Brussels had 16 municipalities, so only 3 were not part of it. And those 3 last, so it's Evere, Berchem, Saint-Agathe, and Gansoren, became part of the Brussels agglomeration only in the 50s. So, in fact, the growing of Brussels is a reality until the Second World War. But after the Second World War, it's more balanced experience, because some of the municipalities, the municipality of the first crown, such as Scarbeck, for example, began to lose inhabitants after the Second World War, because in fact, with the development of individual cars, people were searching another area and they went to more greener area. And so Brussels lost inhabitants after the Second World War. But of course, some municipalities still won because they were still very green. And so municipalities such as Oderghem, WWII, and so on, only developed in that period. You could say in the interwar period, there were still more or less villages, and they became more urbanized after the Second World War. But in reality, Brussels has lost inhabitants during a very long time, and it's only very recently that, again, people came back to Brussels and that we have now a new demographic boom regarding to the period of the 50s or the 60s.
So after the Second World War, people moved to the Green Belt, as we call it.
Yes, because they had cars, because it was very easy
in and out,
to go in and out.
And what was the population roughly after the Second World War figure?
Before 1940, so in 1940 we had more or less 900 inhabitants, and it go to 1 million. So it didn't grow that much anymore.
Okay. Chantal, I want to thank you for your time today, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Voilà.